Coming up on Your Week. Protesters take to the streets in our nation's capital and in big cities across America, demanding justice over the death of an unarmed man at the hands of police. Plus,
ignition, liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
Another historic week in America with a space launch off of Cape Canaveral. We'll cover this and more on Your Week. Hello, this is Your Week, and I'm your host, Eddie McCoven. Our top story, civil unrest in America. Hundreds of thousands of protesters are taking to the streets across the nation, speaking out against the death of a Minneapolis man, George Floyd, who died in police custody on Memorial Day. The 4 officers involved in the arrest of Floyd, which was all caught on video and distributed widely over social media, were all fired the next day. 44-year-old police officer Derek Chauvin was the officer who pinned down Floyd by placing his knee on Floyd's neck. The officer had 18 prior complaints on his department personnel file. Chauvin has since been arrested and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Charges could be pending for other officers involved as well. Protests began peaceful in the city, but turned violent, with scenes of riots and looting, the breaking of business windows, and with a Minneapolis police substation being set on fire. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has called out the National Guard to help restore order in the streets of Minneapolis.
And we simply ask for cooperation to help us reestablish order on our streets, to make it clear that the force that has been put on the ground is there for the long haul, that this is not a place where violence is any way going to step on or dilute the message that we've got work to do around racial injustices. We've got work to do to bring justice for George.
Governor Walz also asked Minnesota residents to stay home tonight and not protest after reports of many out-of-state protesters converging on the metro area, leading to speculation that the out-of-towners are the ones inciting violence. Other protests against police brutality of people of color soon began popping up around the nation, with protesters blocking traffic in Los Angeles and more than 200 protesters in New York being arrested following an outbreak of violence in that city. A protest also took place in front of the White House Friday. Army veteran Marilyn White says these officers involved in the death of George Floyd need to be held accountable.
I want to see the violence stop. I want to see the officers held accountable, not just charged, because charges doesn't mean nothing. Okay, being charged don't mean nothing. But when they got to do time, because had that been me, all I had to do is knock the officer down, and I got felony charge. He can kill a man and get, what, third degree charges? Really? We got to do better than that.
Secret Service members clashed with protesters outside the White House, and a Fox News reporter and his cameraman were reportedly assaulted by protesters. This happened the same day a CNN reporter and crew were arrested live on air for refusing to leave the scene of a protest in Minneapolis. Author and National Public Radio TV critic Eric Deggans says there could be more at play, but says the arrest of journalists doesn't make sense.
Why would you focus on professional journalists that you know are not doing anything serious to break the law when, stores are being broken into and fires are being set? It boggles my mind.
Deggans also said he's pushing for folks to cut back on watching cable TV news due to what some could argue is sensationalized coverage of current events.
I've been recommending people for quite some time now moderate their intake of cable news because television and especially cable TV news is rooted in conflicts and emotionalism and stirring up powerful feelings. That's how they get people to watch the channel, for hours and hours.
The response from the federal government has been rather pointed. President Trump spoke out against the death of George Floyd over Twitter, and then followed the remark with a rather chilling statement on Friday, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Well, critics claimed the president was suggesting rioters be shot. Others said the phrase came from a 1960s-era Miami police chief who professed his disdain for civil rights activists. Several hours later at a briefing, the president defended his remarks.
Well, I've heard that phrase for a long time. I don't know where it came from, where it originated. I view that phrase as...
In 1967, the Miami police
Well, I don't know.
chief
I've also
used it.
heard from many other places, but I've heard it for a long time, as most people have. And frankly, it means when there's looting, people get shot and they die. And if you look at what happened last night and the night before, you see that. It's very common. And that's the way that was meant, and that's the way I think it was supposed to be meant. But I don't know where it came from. I don't know where it originated. I wouldn't know a thing like that. But I will say it's very accurate in the sense that when you do have looting, like you had last night, people often get shot and they die, and that's not good, and we don't want that to happen.
Attorney General William Barr said the outrage over George Floyd's death is real and legitimate, but said extremist groups are taking advantage of the situation.
Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. In many places, it appears the violence is planned, organized, and driven by anarchic and left extremist groups, far left extremist groups, using Antifa-like tactics, many of whom travel from outside the state to promote the violence.
AG Barr also said it's a federal crime to cross state lines or use interstate facilities to participate in or incite violent riots. In our State Watch, it's been just over a decade since American astronauts have been launched into space from American soil.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA. Go SpaceX. Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
America has launched. And so rises a new era of American spaceflight, and with it the ambitions of a new generation continuing the dream.
2 NASA astronauts made history Saturday as they took off into orbit from Cape Canaveral, Florida, aboard a rocket ship designed and built by SpaceX, a company founded by tech entrepreneur Elon Musk, making it the first launch of astronauts into orbit by a private firm. The astronauts are headed to the International Space Station. U.S. astronauts usually have to hitch a ride with the Russians when heading to the space station, since NASA operations have begun to wind down. President Trump spoke at an event Saturday after the launch.
Today, we once again proudly launch American astronauts on American rockets, the best in the world, from right here on American soil. Those of us who saw the spectacular and unforgettable liftoff this afternoon watched more than an act of history. We watched an act of heroism.
The president praised the astronauts and called it a moment of pride and unity among Americans. In Faith and Freedom, this week we have witnessed the use and abuse of the First Amendment to our United States Constitution, as states began to issue guidance on reopening churches during the COVID-19 pandemic, after the federal government reclassified houses of worship as essential businesses. Some governors issued guidance that still puts a lot of limits on this fundamental freedom. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom limited in-person gatherings at churches to 100 people or 25% of building capacity, whichever is lower. Other guidelines include mandatory temperature checks of staff and volunteers, and the suggestion that churches not sing or recite prayers together in effort to curtail the possible spread of the virus from person to person. They also recommend services be shorter and held outside, which is a great idea unless you live in the desert. A church in Southern California, the South Bay United Pentecostal Church in Chula Vista, sued the governor, calling for the state to allow churches to reopen immediately. A lower court and appellate court sided with the governor, and the Supreme Court of the United States, well, they declined to hear the case. Many Christian churches in the Golden State and elsewhere are intent on reopening their doors this weekend in observance of the Festival of Pentecost, which marks the beginning of the Christian church. So, we know the First Amendment enshrines the free exercise of religion as one of our core values as Americans. The First Amendment, of course, does that and much more. For those of you who have never read it, here it is. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, so reading this colonial English and taking a slightly more modern take on this, the government can't sponsor a specific religion. In other words, there is no Church of America like there is a Church of England. But the government cannot stop religious activity, whether it's individuals or groups. There is, however, no specific separation of church and state. In God we trust is on our currency. Politicians and judges are often sworn in on a Bible, usually the Protestant canon. And there are chaplains in both the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. We have, by order of Congress, a national cathedral in Washington, D.C. Christmas Day is also a federal holiday. So, there is no real complete separation of church and state. The government just does not sponsor one specific religion or sect, although, arguably, Christianity, which is the faith most practiced in the U.S., is highly favored, and to a lesser extent, so is Judaism. Second part, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Okay, the federal government can't decide what you can and cannot say, and can't stop the media from reporting on specific topics. This means you can speak your mind. You can say what you want, right or wrong, opinion or fact. If you can speak it, you can say it, and there's almost nothing the government or anyone else can do about it. And again, we have a free press, which is supposed to be able to hold the government and society accountable, not be in bed with the government or special interests, just report what's going on, the facts, or at least that's the implied notion. And the third part, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. The right to assemble peacefully, not just hang out in a public park or drive on a public road, both of which you pay to use as a taxpayer, but this means you can protest. Yes, protesting is protected by the First Amendment. You can speak out against anything and anyone, even your own government, which is something I think as Americans we take for granted. But what all this hinges on, whether it be the practice of religion, free speech, the press, or protesting, what this all hinges on is this. You can do all of these things so long as you are not bringing harm to anyone or anything. You can practice your religion, protest, publish your articles, as long as you are not interfering with the unalienable right of the individual to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness, well, that could be translated as livelihood. People have a right to work and make a living, including owning their own business and having their own home and property. The moment when your practice of religion infringes on the right of one's life, liberty, and livelihood, well, You've crossed a line, and you cannot practice your religion in the U.S. in such a way. That is why human sacrifice, cannibalism, animal sacrifice, self-harm, and polygamy are not allowed in the U.S., even under the auspices of religious practice, because it inflicts harm on life and liberty. This is also why conversion therapy, for those struggling with sexual orientation, is also not permitted in some states, because it harms the individual more than it helps them. We have libel and slander laws to protect people from unwarranted defamation, meaning you can't say something about someone in a public space that is flat out false or misleading. You cannot willfully damage the character of a person, business, or organization without consequence. And when it comes to protesting, yes, you have the God-given right to do it, but you do not have the right to obstruct a right-of-way. Protesting does not give you the right to prevent others from walking down a sidewalk or driving down a street or be able to otherwise carry on with their day. Protesters do not have the right to express their anger or frustration in such a way that they begin assaulting other individuals, including counter-protesters or officers of the law. Protesters do not have the right to destroy property and steal, because this is an infringement on the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rioting and looting, assault, and blocking traffic also don't help your cause. It just makes people upset with you. This week in U.S. history, May 24th, 1883, after 14 years of construction, the Brooklyn Bridge over New York's East River officially opens. May 25th, 1977, cinema patrons embark on a journey long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away when Star Wars opens in theaters. May 26th, 1896, the Wall Street Journal began publishing the Dow Jones Industrial Average. May 27, 1942, Doris Dory Miller becomes the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross for her extraordinary courage aboard the USS West Virginia during the attack on Pearl Harbor. May 28, 1957, the National Baseball League approves the move of the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants to California. May 29, 1790, Rhode Island becomes the 13th original colony to ratify the United States Constitution. And May 30th, 1922, the Lincoln Memorial is dedicated in Washington, D.C. Now it's time for our listener survey. Do you think houses of worship should be allowed to open at this point during the pandemic? Here are those results. Nearly 68% of you say, no, it's not time for that yet. 20% said yes, allow churches to reopen completely. And just over 13% said churches should be allowed to reopen their doors, but with restrictions in place. This week's survey is about protesting. First question, do you think protesters should be allowed to block traffic? Second question, do you feel looting and rioting during a protest is permissible under the First Amendment? Go to eddiejmccoven.com and register your answer on the survey form. Results will be discussed next week. If you like what you've heard on the program, feel free to contact me on social media at Eddie McCoven TV or through the contact form on my website. That's all for now. Thank you for listening. This has been your week. I'm Eddie McCoven, and remember, as Sir Winston Churchill once said, you have enemies? Good. That means you've stood up for something sometime in your life. We'll catch you again next time, America.